All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last seminar for the semester. Today we have our colleague Phil Olsen here, who is going to introduce the speaker for the day.
Thanks. I'm just trying to find my note to myself. Where did it go? You're too quick for me, John. Here we go. Dobry din.
Добрый день.
Hello, everybody. Mark Shtanov is a Muscovite who once helped make beer in a Hong Kong brewery. But what brings him here today is his work as a PhD candidate in architecture at the University of Manchester. About a year and a half ago, Mark reached out to me about our shared interest in the disposal of, necro waste, specifically dead human bodies and body parts. My research, he wrote, focuses on the spatial, technological, and material organization of respectful disposal, the procedure of disposing of imported anatomic specimens at the UK-based high-temperature and clinical waste incinerators. My study uses a waste studies lens to examine the difficulties the waste managers face in designing a respectful process at industrial sites not suited for mortuary rites. So one really fascinating aspect of Mark's work is his use of drawing. He is an architect after all, as a research method and as a means of sharing knowledge. One of our own amazing grad students, Lois Wen, is also an architect, a landscape architect, who shares with Mark an interest in drawing as a means of producing and sharing knowledge. I imagine we'll have an opportunity to talk with Mark more about that during the Q&A. But today, Mark is going to talk to us about respectful disposal, industrial incineration as a final disposition method. Please join me in giving Mark a warm welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Phil. Thanks to Virginia Tech and to the SDS department for inviting me, doing all the hard work to get me over here. Thank you to everyone who made it here on this snowy day, and to those joining us online as well. I am a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. I am in my last 6 months before the submission, and I will be sharing some of my findings and reflections on what Phil correctly described as this sort of industrialized method for disposing of human body parts. The talk will consist of 3 main sections, which include some ethnographic findings and some reflections on each one, with some conclusions and potential reflections on the future, where it might go towards the end. Just as a starting point, just a kind of a brief background to who I am. I'm a qualified architect in the UK. I studied architecture at the University of Bath, where I was quite passionate about buildings for waste and waste infrastructure. I did my master's at the University of Cambridge, looking at something radically different, hospitality schools in West Africa. I then qualified as an architect, worked for 5 or 6 years on some residential projects, on pasta restaurants as well. And I have been doing this PhD research from 2021, initially part-time and then full-time, looking, again, returning to the topic of waste. So if this was my final year thesis project at Bath 10 years ago, this proposal for a rather big and imposing waste sorting facility in the middle of a coastal town in the southwest of England, kind of making the question of waste prominent and really quite exposed, quite centralized. I've been doing similar sort of work in the more recent years around waste incinerators. So this is one of my drawings of one of the UK-based incinerator sites I've visited for the field work. There is a distinction between standard domestic waste incinerators which burn at these sort of temperatures, 1500 Fahrenheit, where all the general rubbish goes from households and from businesses, and a higher temperature incinerator which burns at a significantly higher temperature, which is suitable to accept pretty much any substance, including toxic chemicals, some low-level radioactive material, dead animals, confiscated police waste like drugs and gunpowder, a whole variety of things. And what I picked up on during one of the site visits to high-temperature incinerator is anatomical waste, which in my mind was kind of smaller bits from surgery or from perhaps amputated elements of the body. But I was then really surprised that they get these entire significant body parts like heads, like torsos, at these incinerators, and they have to deal with them in a certain special, respectful process, which is called respectful disposal on some sites. So having been quite disturbed and overwhelmed by these news, I then decided to do my PhD specifically about this procedure, but focusing on the topic from the perspective of waste management rather than from position of sort of death studies or medicine or ethics of around the disease. I wanted to explore how how does the human body become waste that can be incineratable through the lens of waste studies and waste management. So before I go on before I continue with these findings and reflections, I just wanted to say a few thoughts on the use of drawings. So I use drawings all the way throughout the presentation and my PhD and my articles for different purposes. Most of the drawings you'll see in the presentations are done by me unless specifically stated. So this one in the middle at the top is a participant drawing that a waste manager did in one of my focus group workshops, which is a useful way to kind of see how people from different backgrounds, whether they're from medicine or from waste or from mortuary rites and sort of funerary industry, reflect on the same topic of body becoming waste. It's a sort of common language that we all use. I use drawings to try to visualize things like respect or dignity or sensitivity towards human remains in this case, because when we try to map those sentiments onto actual machinery and spaces, people have quite different thoughts in mind. It's a useful method to piece together a story which happens across different sites and professional domains, which is a little snippet here on the bottom left, but we'll look into that a bit closer. Understanding abstract ideas, especially in academic research. So when Phil and I talked about necro-waste, I still wasn't fully sure what this sort of conceptual lens means. So I had to go and read some articles, and I made this drawing here on the right to show what I understand myself by necro-waste. And then I go in my dissertation, I go to kind of describe it and have the image almost as a reference point with the reader to see whether we agree on it or not. And I use similar approach as well for my literature review. So I looked at this British artist, Grayson Perry, who uses maps to kind of describe his mind and his own psychology. So this is me reflecting about the PhD about a year ago, thinking of the different kind of theories that I'm trying to bridge together. So this is currently heavily resting on in discard or waste studies, which is this sort of area of land to the right with the different technologies and perspectives on waste, death studies, and particularly that area, the sort of conceptual lens of necro-waste. But medical humanities, for instance, that's not been too prominent a year ago, but I've been increasingly within that domain. So that kind of part of the map needs to grow. I use drawings to gauge my ethical focus in this project, and it is quite complex because if you look at some of these practices revolving around these anatomical specimens that end up waste, whether you look at it from the medical perspective or from the waste perspective, you may prioritize different interests. And I did come across some resistance, for example, in terms of trying to draw the cadavers or body parts at biomedical labs. So this image is of me visiting an anatomy school and asking whether I can come in to draw some of the training procedures that they have. And the colleague there said that the images should only be for educational purposes, and we're not fully sure where your research is going and how you're using it. Which is fair enough, but that to me helped me made a reflection on it, which in the first place I was going to use drawing as a method, but then I ended up using drawing as a way to tell that story of how that kind of ethical focus is being shaped, and it's still being shaped in this project. There's still some struggles I'm having. And certain things that I haven't seen, I'm still trying to draw. So this is me interviewing an anatomist about how do they actually slice a human body into these sort of standardized sections, like the head, like the torso, the limbs. The person said, well, we just freeze it and we run it through a bandsaw to make the cuts neat. And because I wouldn't be allowed to go and look at that, I said, well, could I draw that, and then perhaps you could have a look and see if that's more or less accurate. But the point is not really the accuracy, but it's also, I guess, the accuracy of the drawing is more or less the same as the accuracy of the idea in my own head. So there's certain proportionality compared to like a highly realistic photograph. And I don't want to look at too many photographs or videos of people going through a bandsaw. So there's certain thing that I want to almost make come out of my own head. And through doing this drawing, it makes me at peace as well. So first, well, we can, coming back to what the anecdote I told you about from that waste incinerator, I'm going to go a few steps back and show where these specimens, or at least the majority of them, come from, which is the United States. So and I haven't been here for field work, so the part that's revolves around the origins of these body parts is mainly based on interviews and on other literature, and people have done quite a lot of research into this. So the funerals are expensive, and the human tissue banks appear to be quite underregulated. In the US, there is the American Association for the Tissue Banks, but tissue banks that are not complying with their standards can still accept donations and do different manipulations with those bodies. And even those that do comply with the Tissue Bank Association, they still export heavily body parts to Europe, and I've come across at my study sites with body parts exported by all sorts of different American tissue banks. There's quite a lot of research done into this, and I'm giving this more as a background through my kind of visual lens. So when the body has been donated, sometimes it's second-person donation. Some of them apparently come from prisons as well, for different purposes, for different reasons. Some people want to do good for the society. In other cases, it's because funerals are expensive. But then, especially for shipping these body parts abroad, they do, as I've discovered through one of the interviews, they do slice them into these sections using a bandsaw. The bodies are the body parts are packaged. These are lemon-scented towels, at least some of the time. They're packed into these sort of padded boxes or coolers. And the interest in my study is primarily with the body parts that then travel to the UK and are then unpacked, stored in walk-in freezers at the repository of body parts at the various anatomy schools and at different for-profit businesses as well that use human tissue to make pharmaceuticals, to make implants and various other products. That part is also quite obscure to me. I've not been to any of these pharmaceutical or implant manufacturing sites to draw that in more detail, and that's a potential future avenue for the work. So far, my interest has been primarily in disposal. So you defrost a specimen 2-3 times to help students train on it, to extract some kind of parts of the human tissue, to train robots, to do various tests, but eventually it becomes dilapidated and the laboratory needs to get rid of it. It cannot be cremated or buried in the UK because of the different funerary and cremation rules. It's a disconnected body part. The name is not attached to it. There's only sort of like a serial barcode number hanging on the ear or attached somewhere else. So you can't send it to a crematorium. Crematorium staff were quite horrified when I told them about all this. They don't come across, they only come across UK donated bodies. So you cannot cremate them. To send them back to the United States is expensive. You cannot be certain that they will be fully sort of cremated and returned to their family. There have been cases where it's just a foot or a hand that's cremated and returned. The rest is incinerated. So there's pros and cons to different options. And the most cost-effective option for a UK laboratory is to send them to a waste incinerator in a plastic container. So they kind of look like plastic barrels of different sizes. You can package even multiple body parts in there. The Human Tissue Authority, who regulate this in the UK, they allow incineration with the caveats that it's done separately to other types of waste. And there's also the word respect that's used quite a lot in their documents, and that's taken on board by the people who have to be handling this. They go to waste sites in these discrete white vans, and this is what one of the waste incinerators look like. There's a couple of ways to get the waste up to a certain level from which it kind of cascades down inside the incineration chamber. So at this particular site, you've got a conveyor belt going up, you've got a lift as well, and so once it gets to the top, the containers kind of drop down into this space called the charge box at the top there, and the mechanical ram kind of pushes them into the incineration chamber, and then they progress down in this stepped hearth system. And there's another system as well called the rotary kiln, which is very similar, where the lift brings the waste up, drops the containers down, and then they gradually progress in this sort of big revolving machine. And the smoke goes out and gets filtered, goes into the atmosphere. The ashes are collected and sent to landfill. And sometimes you have steam or energy supply to nearby, like industrial facility or hospital, where that steam or energy is used for different purposes. But it's only less than 1% of all the waste these facilities receive. So it is quite rare to receive these specimens, but they leave quite an impact on the workers there. So do it respectfully. That's what Human Tissue Authority expects. How to do that respectfully in the waste incinerator is a question. It's not very clear how to map respect onto all these machines and spaces and all this sort of noise and smell and this overwhelming environment that's happening in the background. Environmental agencies who regulate waste contractors have no say on this and say this is all up to the Human Tissue Authority, who don't regulate waste contractors, who regulate the biomedical labs and schools and businesses, and they tell them, well, you just choose the best method you can, send them, and make sure it's done separately to the other waste. What the separation means, whether it's half an hour of break, whether you can't have anything that same day with these specimens, is completely left for the waste contractor to decide. One of the things they do is stop all the other waste coming up the conveyor belt in this case, carefully bring those drums with the human specimens into the lift, send them up, have them incinerated. The slight issue with that, in terms of how some of the stakeholders imagine respect, is because at the top of the lift, you've got this platform that kind of topples over, so the drums roll down into the charge box, and that could be perceived as disrespectful. So in some cases, what the waste contractor offers as an option for like the extra sort of premium level of respect is we take them up all the way upstairs to the level of the charge box. We bring the drums into, they dismantle this hatch in the kind of protecting area, exposing workers to more heat, slightly more dangerous environment. They manually place the drums into the charge box, and then the ram sweeps them across into the incineration chamber. In very rare instances, there are priests and celebrants coming to waste sites to give last rites to anatomical waste. Sometimes the staff from the biomedical facility also follow the specimens along and oversee the process of disposal. So there is, in a way, there's a kind of a menu of options. There's a range of there's kind of a catalogue of the services of respect that are available. And if they are asked about them, each waste contractor says, well, we can do the respect level A or B or C, depending what you prefer. So it's a range of business, rather than a sentiment of respect, it's more of a range of business-to-business services. The other observation, and this sort of ties in a little bit into the kind of the theories I'm using, is this idea from Michel Foucault about power ignoring death and not caring, almost sort of being quite shy to engage with death because death is outside of this sort of biopolitical influence to make the society disciplined and economically productive and so on. So these kind of pockets of legislation, these gaps which are omitted from control because there is kind of less importance there in biopolitical terms, from Foucault's perspective, which then John Troyer picks up and says, well, these gaps of regulation result in technologies having to pick up and compensate for that ignorance, and technologies kind of reveal themselves in this treatment of situations where death or the dead body in this case is ignored. And my sort of addition or my take on what Troyer talks about is that it's not really just the technologies, but it's the entire sort of infrastructural systems that are involved, including different machines, including industrial spaces in this case, including human labor that is also subjected to compensate for some moral hesitation on behalf of someone else as a form of reassurance. We'll do it respectfully, don't worry guys. But then that obviously takes emotional toll on the actual immediate reactors who have to carry these drums, who have to deal with it, who know that there is body parts inside, and who have these kind of disturbing thoughts afterwards. So there's sort of an element of moral cleansing for someone else at the expense of these social groups who end up doing this kind of work. So having discovered those procedures, I was quite unsettled. I decided to go back and ask some specialists, what do you guys think? Is this okay? So I organized a series of focus group workshops with two groups of people. One group of people is, I broadly call them death specialists. and there are people in academia, in art, in design who work around the topic of death, from tangible things like coffin design to more ritualistic things like how to grieve, how to prepare for death, things like that. So there was a big conference at the University of Falmouth 2 years ago where I assembled 19 so-called death specialists and asked them the question on the previous slide, are these practices respectful? And also a group of waste workers. I went to 3 different waste incinerators and organized focus group workshops there and asked the waste workers, what do you think about these practices? What would you do differently? Now, having the word respect in that question wasn't necessary. And in fact, it was kind of preloading respect on people who may not want to see it that way. But it did reveal, nevertheless, different perspectives on this issue. So the workshops were held around different size of tables of different size. The participants discussed the issues that I was presenting. I presented more or less the same drawings that I just showed you a few minutes ago. They were left to discuss. They had some time to kind of present the idea of their group at the end. All of that was voice recorded to then be cross-related with the other findings. And the other important element is the drawings. So I gave them all paper and they were all drawing their responses and thinking about it sort of materially, physically, and also ritualistically through drawings, to kind of also try to speak the same language between the 2 groups of respondents who come from very different backgrounds. So I had a whole assembly of different drawings, and I will just ponder on some of these with some quotes from the respondents. Broadly, there were 4 different types of reaction to the process, so around these 4 different aspects of current respectful disposal procedure. So looking at the waste container, for example, the death specialists were saying you've got to make the container more cognizant, more designed more around like there is human body part in there, make that acknowledged, do a different design, put a fragile sticker. A waste worker says, none of that, just make all the bins the same. I don't want to know what we're burning. Although interestingly in that drawing, there is what kind of looks like a human face on the right in this particular example. In terms of doing any kind of ritual during this industrial procedure, the death specialists again went into saying you've got to play some music, there's got to be some poetry recited, there's going to be special engravings and some kind of memorial that's installed at the incinerator, a moment of silence. The waste workers say, well, again, the main kind of line of thought is that we didn't sign up for this, we don't want to be working with human remains, we just want to treat it as waste. Quite often they would sort of refer to being quite poorly paid for their job and not being trained in mortuary rites and not wanting to do anything. So this, for example, is just a standard diagram of the waste incinerator as it is. There's no addition here for anything acknowledging death. Sometimes one of the more senior workers would say, well, they're going to start to need more time off. They're going to start to go see psychologists. Wetherspoons is a chain of pubs, so this manager is anticipating the worker might go and spend more time at the pub than needed at the end of the workday. There was an interesting reaction to this tumbling issue. So where the drums fall down from the lift and there's risk of them tumbling over, some of the death specialists took that with a kind of pinch of humor in a way, and were saying, well, that's quite ridiculous. But if it's all about the drum falling down, why don't you put some kind of mechanical arm that just props it up and call it the respector, and it would just hold it up. The waste workers approached this with more of a technical positioning. So there was one of the guys said you could have a crane that carefully lowers the waste drum into the charge box without having any kind of manual labor of carrying it up there. Another person said, why don't you put a separate door into the ram housing, so when the ram is pulled back, you carefully place the drum and then off it goes with the ram into the chamber. You could do a whole different mini incinerator on the back of the main incinerator and just load these specimens separately in a careful way. And this person had sort of a genius way of connecting all the filtration systems with the main incinerator, so it would still have kind of embeddedness into like the industrial facility. You could return ashes and have someone working in a, so this could kind of be almost like a mini crematorium, but what this person was saying is that you shouldn't have people from this site working on this facility. You need to hire separate staff who would be willing to engage with the topic of human remains. There were some proposals to be away from the incinerator. So, for example, because sometimes the heat from the plant is used to supply steam to hospital laundries, this person from the death conference was saying, why didn't you acknowledge that in the hospital? Why didn't you say this little pillowcase was dried with some body parts? How you would draw that connection, I would really struggle to imagine. Having like a sort of a memorial remembrance garden where you would sprinkle some of these ashes in memory of the donated specimens. Again, these are highly impractical solutions because you have all sorts of toxic ashes emerging out of an industrial waste incinerator, and you couldn't just have this. You'd have to shut that whole memorial down, and you can't let people into there. But the waste workers, in response to that, were saying, well, you could perhaps have a golf course, you cover the landfill with some radon barrier, you make a golf course there in acknowledgement of these diseased specimens. But you cannot actually have that in the site where it all happens. So it shouldn't be anywhere near to where we work because we don't want to know about it. And in a couple of cases, there was like a whole separate incinerator that's proposed somewhere else, centralized for the whole country, to send all these anatomical specimens. I mean, given their quantity, this wouldn't really operate financially and in terms of all the transportation. But it kind of shows you an indication that, again, waste workers say, we don't want anything to do with this. There was more elements of humor involved, and so a helter-skelter is this kind of amusement ride where there's like a slide basically around the lighthouse. And this particular death specialist said, well, why don't we have a separate type of incinerator, which is like a helter-skelter with these different conveyor belts converging on the lighthouse. And they even proposed sorting the body parts. So you've got fingers, you've got bums, torsos, other bits. You've got the trauma room if the worker falls into the helter-skelter. So things were, it was almost taken to like it was ridiculed in a way. And we should be thinking about these things with humor. We should be cognizant with really sort of the injustices behind the whole system of where these body parts come from and who these bodies are and so on. But then you could perhaps, I feel like I appreciate that for some people that's a way of protecting themselves from a topic that's potentially quite gruesome and difficult, and they react in these kind of humorous ways. The two main reactions from the focus groups. On the one hand, the death specialists saying you've got to make it more acknowledged, you've got to play music, you've got to really sort of embellish, acknowledge this fact of human remains going through this industrial process. And on the other hand, the waste workers saying nothing to do with me, I don't want to know, I don't want to be dealing with human remains. The responses indicated as well that at first someone working with these body parts would become quite disturbed, quite, it would kind of follow them along, that they were dropping some heads through the charge box, and they would go home and think about it and have that discomfort, whereas sometime afterwards they would just see them more as drums of waste, and they would kind of reprogram their own perception to think of these human remains purely as waste material for their own peace of mind. So as the next stage of the project, I went on to, I was trying to make a link between this reaction amongst the waste staff to be kind of desensitized and distancing themselves from the origins and what the waste actually has, what the container has inside, and the whole overall system of how do we have it that human body ends up being kind of a commodity and then waste, which brought me into a series of medical humanities sources that study. So it's a widely studied phenomena of donated body becoming the circulating product that's sort of for sale. And although the companies wouldn't pay for the body part as such, they would be paying high fees for the transportation and the storage, which in a way are the kind of the roundabout way, the way around buying human bodies such. So a lot of the medical humanities literature focuses on the top part of this sequence of images. So what happens at the donation moment, how the body is disconnected, how these parts circulate and values created through that circulation, how they're sort of standardized to be more sort of like a product. And there's like a Big Mac analogy in one of the sources where it's sort of standardized to a level that you always, whatever branch of a tissue bank you go to, you always get the same cut of a certain body part. But there is quite little focus in medical humanities on this latter part of what actually happens at the end. And it's not an easy procedure to dispose of human tissue. It's not something, it's not like any other waste, because it's quite regulated, and it's quite expensive. And so what I've observed through my fieldwork is that this, amongst other advantages of perhaps distance and logistical simplicity, it's also the cheapest solution, because what they pay, at least in one of the sites, is £900 per ton. So I've made a conversion there, which is a lot cheaper than any form of kind of funerary procedure, and or sending them back to the country of origin. And that, in a way, seemed to have some kind of critical part in that whole commodity geography, all these different networked spaces and businesses that happened beforehand. So to think of it in a slightly more theoretical way, I turned to Agamben and kind of his studies of the concentration camps and how a person or a body loses its kind of civic status and becomes stripped of its rights, becomes bare, and then anything you want can be done to that person. And whilst Agamben in sort of looks at this sort of life, sort of raw or basic life, I think is bio and zoe, contrast between that sort of life imbued with rights versus the bare form of life. In my case, it focuses more kind of on the death and how a human body is stripped of its moral and civic rights already kind of in a post-mortem state. And what I feel I'm observing in this case is the kind of a parallel process of alienation whereby the industrial workers involved with this choose not to think of these specimens as former humans. They choose to kind of disengage from the social history of the specimen, whether as a person or as a commodity that was circulating. They choose to think of them as waste, and that helps with the overall sort of disentanglement of those specimens from their kind of former human past, in a way, where they are not only sort of disconnected from their first life as a human person, but then through this infrastructural procedure of alienating and making the workers really not think of them as people, the specimens are then disconnected from their kind of status as a commodity, and then they can be appreciated and seen and treated just as waste. So this is the procedure that in one of my articles, I'm calling decouplement, in a sense that it's sort of the specimen that's decoupled from its human status and from its kind of state of commodity as well, and turned into something else, which is this incineratable waste. And of course, there is this gap in legislation between these different regulatory bodies that permits this. And in this case, capital kind of thrives where there is a regulatory gap. There is lucrative opportunities all the way sort of up the chain of different other participant groups, because this solution is made possible and legal, and it can be and you can send these specimens to an incinerator at the end. So to kind of move into the conclusions of this, the two key messages are that respect, as well as a sentiment or a feeling, it can be this set of services that are kind of agreed contractually over the phone. They happen between businesses, and respect in this form is then mapped onto a series of space and machines and human labor, but also emotional labor that takes kind of that moral obligation of someone else. And it does seem like a sort of ad hoc constellation of different industrial solutions, which are slightly different depending which site you go to, and it's all a bit situational. But if you kind of zoom out and take a wider systematic view on it, you then realize that it's an infrastructural operation that's exploited to then make possible body commodification and turning people into commodities to then be able to turn them into these incineratable things. So the PhD is by journal format, so I've been working on a series of papers to discuss kind of different aspects of the issue and of my method as well. These are the 5 papers I've been writing. The first one is about drawings as a method, as a kind of this mediating tool, whether we talk when we talk about this process, and some groups of people would see that the same entity as a person, as a donor. Others would see it in a sort of more business-like way, as a commodity, as something that can be sort of traded and exchanged. And then other groups of people say, well, no, that's just waste, and I don't want to think of it in any other way. So drawings are kind of form this connecting link in that sense. The second article I was working on, and that was published recently, is on respectful disposal itself, and what do we mean by respect when it's mapped onto this kind of series of infrastructures, machines, and industrial activities. The third paper draws more on Michel Foucault and talks about the biopolitical regimes of sanitation and of healthcare and of kind of keeping the society healthy and long-lasting, going in opposite direction to the necropolitical regime of administering and dealing with the human bodies. And in this case, the kind of the tension between biopolitical and necropolitical interests happens at these incineration sites, and that's where there is this kind of dichotomy of this industrial Fordist process of efficient destruction of everything society is getting rid of, versus acts of respect, pausing, acknowledging human dignity, trying to humanize what was previously dehumanized, as one of my respondents said. The fourth paper is about what I call decouplement, is a working title, and it's about how the living worker is kind of disengaging from the object of their labor, without not wanting to think of the kind of the social history of the objects that are coming to these plants. whilst the body is being kind of decoupled from its former status as a human being or as commodity. And the fifth paper it doesn't have any argument. It's a comics, so it's a comics. I'm going to send it to a medical journal that does graphic medicine and see. It just tells the story basically. So. Wrapping up now, where the research might be heading afterwards or what feels to be unexplored. So a lot of these activities with these donated bodies, like the extraction, manufacturing, the pharmaceuticals, making implants from them, they're quite unexplored, and there is potential. They are kind of explored in their niche domain of medicine or critique of medicine, but I've not seen a proper sort of visual or clear narrative that could be told about how particular tissue is extracted from a specimen to make a certain pharmaceutical. So there is potentially more visual work to kind of piece that all together, and also quantify how much of this material is circulating, how much is being exported from the United States, how much is coming to the UK, particularly what does it mostly go to universities or private companies. It's information that's possible to obtain, but it's a whole big project that would need to be done separately. Rather than looking for experts' perspectives, which I've been doing, a potential direction could be to ask the public, what does general public feel and think about these procedures, whether policy suggestions could be made to the stakeholders, particularly to those regulating waste, incineration, and also the legislation of handling the human body parts, potential international agreements that could make this somehow more standardized at least. Environmental impact. I'm part of an environmental research group at Manchester, and based on all my conversations there, no one has actually assessed the carbon footprint of this economy, considering there's a lot of planes and other transport involved, considering all the freezing that's done everywhere, considering even the incineration with all the plastic that goes with these body parts because someone decided it needs to be packaged in a plastic drum. And lastly, respectful disposal, whether it's actually respectful and then whether that kind of redefines the word respect in a certain way. There is a certain procedure of industrialized respectful disposal that's actively practiced. And whether that as an idea could be taken and applied to other things. So could we talk about respectful disposal of ecosystems, of plants, of natural environments, of animals? Could we talk about sort of human communities on a larger scale? And also coming back more to sort of my architectural background, could we talk about respectful disposal of a building? These are potential avenues. If you know anyone who's interested in these topics, I've put my email here so they can reach out to me. That's everything. Thank you very much.
Time for questions? Thank you, Mark. That's a very wonderful and amazing talk about the respectful disposal. I got several questions, but I think I can first throw two questions about it. Okay, only one. Can you give a little bit more detail on the statistics behind the influx of this human body part into UK and the influx and the monthly quantity they need to dealing with in this kind of human body part disposal?
Yeah.
That's kind of, yeah. I just want to know. I just want to, if you can give some number, that would be great. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have any numbers because that would be that it's one of the things I mentioned in the last slide, that it would be a separate project in itself to try to quantify this. There are a few hundred organizations in the UK licensed by the Human Tissue Authority. So to get this, the sense, so to get the scale of this, it would be a matter of doing a freedom of information request to each one of these organizations, asking them, where do you get your specimens and how do you dispose of them? Which would be, yeah, it's a whole separate study, but it hasn't been done. And I know someone, Reuters, I think, did a project on export from the United States, and there was some export data there, but that, again, I asked them about it, and it was very limited.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated the drawings. It was very cool to see, and your process of the focus groups and the methods that you use was also very inspirational.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the idea of respect and who that respect is for, right? We're talking about respect for the remains that are being disposed, and also sort of you bring in the respect that these these waste workers may or may not experience. One thing that really caught me off guard that you mentioned was that a lot of these incinerators generate power for nearby facilities such as hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine that it's very healthy to be receiving the off gas of these incineration waste plants, and it just seems like one piece of this that feels missing from when we think about respect of disposal is not just respect for the dead bodies, but respect for the folks remaining after that thing is gone, right? So the living workers who are working there, as well as the environment around it. I'm wondering if that came up in your research or any of your readings at all, or if respectful disposal has largely centered on the object of disposal. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and there is most of the literature that talks about human remains naturally focuses on the posthumous rights of these donors, what they wanted done to them, what their families wanted. So the consent form, essentially, whatever is in there, and there's loads of like small print and different disposal options and things. But the respect for the dead primarily revolves around them, and I think how they use the word respect to kind of draft these agreements between the waste contractors and whoever sends the waste there primarily revolves around that. And as you point out, it omits some of the other groups who might be involved and who might be vulnerable as well. And I don't know how much of that actually matters to the families or anyone, even that person thinking about kind of what happens to them after they die. Because, I mean, people barely think about what these, and how, like, when the body is divided, parts of it may take this route, part of it may take this route. It seems that a lot of what they call respect is done for the benefit of just those who are sending off, disposing of these human remains, to feel at peace with themselves, that they're choosing a industrial incineration option rather than doing. They haven't got many options, rather than sending them back expensively or dealing with, trying to give it to a crematorium who would absolutely not have any of this. To your other point about heating of the hospitals, so if you've got where you've got the incinerator chamber and you've got the reactor, you've got a coil of water pipe that wraps around the whole, the kind of the hot part where it's all burning, and that water gets heated up to a level where it becomes steam, and that steam is then sent to nearby places within certain radius where you can supply that steam to heat the hospital, for example. So you're not sending that poisonous, toxic smoke. This would obviously never happen. It gets very stringently filtered and comes out of the pipe, and the workers in that control room also have to manage it quite carefully, because you've got to sort of inject certain forms of like a carbon powder and like I think lime powder as well to regulate the kind of the chemical potency of whatever is in that reactor. And if you're too late with that, you've got a massive thing coming from the other side into the atmosphere. And then if you've got to record that, and then the environmental agency comes and monitors you, and again they could be quite harsh on the incinerator staff. But that's simply manipulating the procedure. And another interesting thing is the recipe of the incineration. So it needs to burn at a certain consistent rate with a consistent calorific value. So there is a chemist on site who designs the recipe of the incinerator, what to put in which order. And these kind of human body parts, or giraffes, or the sheep and whoever else they receive go in the special order around the gunpowder, around the chemicals, around all these other substances to create that continuous flow of burning.
So we have a question in the chat. Andrea says, I'm an autonomist. I have benefited profoundly from body donations for teaching and learning. Even though in my country we hold a ceremony in honor of donors, it is almost inevitable that both instructors and students gradually distance themselves from the fact that what lies before us was once a living person. This distance often becomes a psychological strategy that enables us to carry out the work, but it also subtly transforms the body into an object of study. From your experience, how might pedagogical practices that rely on donated bodies resist or inadvertently reproduce the socio-technical logics of commodified corpses, especially in a field like medicine, where the body that is not study material becomes a patient who did not survive?
So, well, the question is about sort of distancing for the purpose, I think, of comfortable work for the medical professionals, there are kind of different arguments about this. There was an exchange between a couple of scholars, May and Feinberg, I think we talked about it, Phil, who, on the one hand, one of them was saying that there should be this profound sentiment that really gets sort of the medical professional, and they work under the influence of that sentiment, whereas the other scholar responding to them was saying, well, actually you've got to limit how much you engage emotionally to work efficiently and ultimately benefit the society in saving more lives. So there seems to be a balance somewhere between being totally desensitized and being emotional, sort of excessively emotional. And I know, so having spoken to the NHS, National Health Service workers in the UK, there are more and more facilities to kind of mediate their sentiment. And for example, there are these wobble rooms where a medical student or a surgeon can go and have a bit of time to themselves if they feel too overwhelmed. That especially like for the first, second year medical students that I've spoken to as well, they need that a bit of distancing and reflection some of the time. And ultimately, that in the workshops, that was proposed, why don't the waste workers also have a wobble room where they can go and kind of go through a moment. I guess the medical facilities, they also have that peaceful environment where you can kind of reconcile your feelings. And at least the anatomy labs I've been to, I actually feel really calm there. And I mean, there is certain, I think, environment which creates that sense of calmness, whether there is sort of slightly more emotion or less emotion that's needed. But certainly in like an industrial site, it's very hard to achieve that calm environment.
Is that me? Thank you first for coming all the way here to Blacksburg. I just want to say how insightful and innovative this approach is, and I really like it. And I'm wondering if you could pull up one of your images for my question. It's the one that says zero cost, infinite impact, I think. You know, it's the one kind of like super optimistic illustration that you have.
It was at the start, I think.
Yeah, it appears a handful of times. Okay, so my question for you is, because after this, all of your images kind of go from like, here's the dream to here's the material reality of things. If you were to organize a workshop for yourself and put to yourself the task of drawing the story you would like to see if the regulations were being formed the way you wanted them to be, or the infrastructure, or people's relationships between the kind of the material and the spiritual and the body, what would your drawings look like? So what is the story that's not what's happening, but the one that, if you were to intervene, might change what happens here? Or is it the case that you're like, just starting from the zero cost, zero impact, we're automatically going down the wrong path?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it depends on the scope of how much could we impact, because it's a global issue of many interconnected institutions and companies who are involved in this, and so already at this stage there's a series of constraints where if you're allowing tissue banks to take those bodies, standardized body parts, and make them circulate internationally, then you're already on this side here, you're within certain restraints. So in my personal view, much of the issues with the crematorium regulations, so there is this huge gap between cremation, which is very, very stringent. You need to have a whole folder of documents from the hospital with the person's names, with all their details, and the human tissue regulations, which are quite, they accommodate, they're aware that body parts are being imported. It's done for various purposes. Some of these are quite critical for the society. Again, donation in the UK is quite stringent, where you have to keep all the pieces together. You cremate that body after a year. If you are a company doing research on only a particular body section, you can't really have like 40 big cadavers stored anywhere. You need to only have a few certain, like just hands or whatever. So Human Tissue Authority, they're cognizant of these constraints and the needs and how it's all circulating, and it's been developing like that for the last sort of 30 years at least. In my personal view, I would work closer with the crematoria and the regulators there, and see whether some kind of intermediate option could exist. There's only certain body parts, and some of them are not identifiable. But could we design an option for that? So at least there are people trained in mortuary rites dealing with them, rather than just dumping it all on these industrial workers who are paid minimal wage.
Online has a question for you.
May I? Yeah. Wonderful talk, Mark, and I'm so glad I got a chance to meet you briefly yesterday. So my question is more a methodological question. So first of all, your use of drawings as a mediating research method was fascinating. So my question is, given that different actors perceive the same specimen as person or donor or commodity or even waste, what have you found to be the limits of visual methods in capturing these conflicting ontologies? Like, were there moments where drawing kind of like fails to breach those epistemic divides?
Well, yeah, sorry. Was there more to it?
No, I said taxomic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. It's kind of trial and error. So some people refused to draw altogether. So some participants in both types of workshops didn't draw at all. They talked, but they had valuable thoughts that they were saying. And obviously they talked from their perspective, either of respecting the body or of like working at peace with waste. But they would be aware of these potential other perspectives because of kind of the briefing to the workshop that I was giving, and I was tell them some of the story of like where the specimens come from and so on. So the drawings has its limits, and if you like in the drawings I was showing, the waste workers' artwork is often quite technical, and they're very good at doing diagrams of the industrial process. Whereas the death specialists, for example, they were quite abstract, and they were thinking how to memorialize and acknowledge death in these more conceptual ways. So the approaches are very different. I feel showing them consistent drawings, in this case made by me, helps, because they try to kind of put people on the same page, I guess. I draw under the influence of different interviews and different kind of talking to different groups. So sometimes it would be more focused around one participant group, but having them together I hope it creates a bit more cohesiveness like that. But it does have limitations, as you say, and there's no way to bring these different groups fully on the same page of how to see these human remains.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Hi, Mark. It was a fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first question is about respect and value. And I was just curious to know that I think in one of your comics you mentioned about how these bodies are coming from prisoners. So I was curious to know about how people, the different actors who are engaging with the body, imagine the sources to be. Are they always aware, not aware? If they're not aware, is it easier for them to imagine that it's, I don't know, coming from a prisoner? That, you know, how does respect operate in the lives that these bodies have lived and in the afterlives of these bodies as waste commodity? And the second question is about your methodology. And I was also fixated about the drawing where the legacy lives on, and, you know, it's almost like a bird's eye view, you know, like, I don't know, God is watching. So I was curious about how do you, since you're also writing and drawing, how do you situate yourself as a researcher? And you are also fixing a gaze, and, you know, I would like to know about your creative process when you decide sort of what gaze to take, what perspective to adopt, and how do you think it informs how you draw it out and how you write it out? And how do you want to communicate that perspective to the viewers of the drawing and the readers of the text?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the first question is about some of the donors coming from prisons. Now, like, I first heard about that at one of the incinerators, and it's a rumor, right? It's something that between them they're kind of like whispering, you know, I heard that some of them are coming from American prison, like all the way from across the whole, like, it's like a TV, like it's kind of like a drama movie series kind of thing. You feel to be a character of this whole like international procedure. And I think that adds a bit of, it feels like they focus on the cool detail rather than on the actual what it is, in a way. I think that's one of the mechanisms to kind of see it in a slightly abstract way, like it's part of some kind of, you know, drama TV kind of episode or something. If I have come across the reference to prisons from a few different stakeholders, and I interviewed some some anatomists and some journalists who work in the United States, and there does seem to be some bodies that come from prisons, and it may not necessarily be just a purely commercial act of, okay, funeral is too expensive, why don't we just dispose of them in this convenient way, just sign off the consent form? Because some of them do mean well, and some of them want that person to do good for the society in their kind of post-mortem way. But they might have been committing crimes, but then why don't they do something good? So there is that sense of perhaps trying to mean well and do something good. In terms of, I think you had the second part to that question about what is it respect for the living? Was there still a life, or that kind of their first life based on some medical humanities literature in their first life as a person? Then it is a kind of an economy that draws divisions between those who are privileged and who benefit and those who are disadvantaged. So there are privileged people, benefiting from all these technologies, from the scientific knowledge that's being developed through the process. There are people who are disadvantaged by having to kind of carry these drums around, transport them, incinerate them, have some kind of disturbance from that. What happens on this side, and I've not looked into it that much, it's unclear, but these are often underprivileged people, quite often people of color, with families who haven't got much of the choice, or they're immigrants in the US. So, and then they seem to be kind of on the margin where this is more easily done to them. So in a way, it's a kind of, it's a procedure that draws divides between kind of those who benefit and those who don't benefit. And these divides don't neatly map onto sort of questions of, like, I don't know, race, colonialism, sexuality, or even like whether you're living or dead. It kind of cuts that divide that's quite complex. So to your second question now, which was, if you just mention a couple of words from it, I'll remember the rest of it.
How do you situate yourself and your
Yes.
personality in a
Yes.
drawing perhaps as an illustrator and also as an author?
And writing as well. So the very first drawings I was doing were architectural drawings, trying to document what the procedure is like. So I was thinking of myself, like in an architectural project, you would do a series of sort of axonometric views. You would cut some sections to look into things where you can't see. And the perspective was, how do we look at it kind of from an architectural or engineering perspective, but acknowledging some of these human and social things that go on in there. So almost like from the technical angle, adding elements of human bit by bit, but coming from architecture. And I was quite, particular, going there with like a laser pointing ruler and measuring the key distances and trying to like make it right proportion of the space. Then eventually with the later drawings, I started taking this more human angle, particularly like this kind of thing. So you see the angle, this is more like a perspective drawing. We're here, we're almost slightly from below where these specimens are. So here I feel, I mean, this is kind of self-analysis, which may not be very good, but there's a bit of like a, being in the scene and almost being a bit dwarfed by these huge drums. And you get pretty big drums, like the 2-liter drum is this tall. It's a big, hefty thing. You can put a couple of torsos in there. So it tries, I guess, I'm playing a little more with like the emotion of me drawing and someone possibly looking at that image and trying to be like brought into that scene. And then the much late, so these images about the kind of the biomedical part were done later, and it's almost like taking a slightly more distance perspective of like almost some kind of CCTV camera, just seeing what happens from a distance. Like there's a few discrete people carrying some objects. There's like a discrete white van. You don't see the faces, like, you know, like that. There's sort of anonymity and unclear, you know, it's not fully clear where this is, who that person is, and so on. So trying to kind of solve the mystery, I guess. Like a lot of these sites, I don't have access to them, so it's purely from an interview that I get that. But it's still, yeah, again, this is like a very eye-level perspective with the specimens in the foreground, and the person being quite discreet and hidden away. And this is almost like me packaging the head, or whoever is looking at the image is, you know, like that one is trying to read the laws and what the hell do I do with this head now, right? Like trying to sort of how to carefully package that box so it's like closes well and you can put some masking tape and stuff, like almost like thinking of it how I would do it. So like this one, I was thinking, so if you had all of them frozen, it's like things in the freezer at home, they would stick together. So actually you need to package them separately. You need to put them separately. You wouldn't actually have them piled as a pile of hands. You'd kind of need to arrange them almost like so it's a drawing kind of makes me, I guess, think of how is it done logistically as a procedure. And this thing, I think it's more kind of like a diagram. So I looked at quite a few promotional materials from the human tissue banks. And none of these are their original quotes. I had to like come up with my own sort of slogans. But this is how their kind of promotional material looks, like the kind of the hearts and the kind of people holding hands and all of those things, which I felt, well, there is a certain sentiment that plays with the whole overall operation that's important, where you do advertise you will be doing something good for the society, which needs to be part of it. And I mean, looking at it from above, it puts the person who died central stage, and all of these characters are almost like secondary. You don't see their faces. It's not too important who individually they are. But it's this kind of the start of the journey that's the focus. And then, so like writing, you said how to kind of to write about it. I try to do it in like a neutral way, I guess. Not too critical of any particular moment of this, but more saying what do we kind of actually learn from it. Yeah.
So we have Lois patiently waiting to ask a question.
Fantastic.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for your talk. It's great to see an update of your work. My question builds on the answer that you just gave, but I was really interested throughout your talk in the ways that you kind of revealed your own like emotional experience dealing with this like subject matter. And so like at times you mentioned like feeling like moments of like horror, like at what you were learning, and then also kind of having to like protect yourself when it came to watching, like figuring out how to represent like the frozen bodies going through the bandsaw. So I was interested in like how you navigated as an artist, like a respectful representation of the subject matter that you are working on.
Yeah, it's still, thank you for the question, Lois. It's still not fully resolved. So I come to do a new, a new diagram or a new drawing, and it always, like, I would do a few drafts which I like discard because I feel that's, it may be not right for whatever. I don't feel ethically, kind of morally at ease using that drawing, showing it with my research. It's a bit of like a trial and error sort of journey. One of the people I speak to about the project is an anatomist who does research on ethics of representation, and with that person we discuss some of the time. So is it ethical to use to draw actual human specimens? Is it okay to copy diagrams from anatomy textbooks? Who were those diagrams based on in the first place? But when were they made? Because like early in history or even a few decades ago, you could use bodies that were sourced in all sorts of ways, were used for diagrams, were used for studying. And now, are we now kind of building our visual language based on some of these practices that would now be very questionable? How do we come into this? And I guess what I find what puts me most at ease is not using any kind of precedent, but trying to come up with it either kind of from my own head of how that would look like, or come up with it and then run it past someone who has seen these things and then correct it, or like if it's some complicated posture or something, I would take a picture of a friend with their permission, or of myself sometimes, and try to then do that based on someone I know and kind of agrees, knowing the work I'm doing. So these images and that approach actually puts me most at ease, because it's not directly using someone who didn't know they would be drawn in a way. So with the anatomy textbook as well, I don't feel very, it doesn't feel very good actually using them for the drawings. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
From what the people told you, could you recognize different ideas of respect regarding different body parts?
Yes. So the interviewees at the anatomy school said there is like an unspoken principle of 2/3, for example. So 2/3 of the mass of the body is considered a person, and they treat them with kind of more in a way that's appropriate for like a whole person. They would send them to a crematorium where there's like British nationals. But 1/3 they can keep and do more experiments with it, and that almost then could kind of get lost into some of the sort of bureaucracy and disposability and in other ways. So there is that kind of the rule of 2/3. I didn't find it in any legislation, but some of the anatomists I spoke to talked about that. So when it comes to the head, for example, the head is important. So very few would consider the head within that 1/3 that doesn't matter. But if, like, when it comes to like a hand, when it comes to smaller bits of tissue, there's definitely less preciousness, and there's more chance for these things to kind of stick around somewhere, and more work is done on them, and then they may be disposed of in a slightly more industrial way.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Apparently online they couldn't hear the question. Do you mind repeating it, David?
Can they hear me now?
Can you guys hear David?
Yeah. Hello? Okay.
So I asked, from what the people told you, were there different ideas of respect? You muted. Do I have to continue to press?
Testing. Okay, sorry. So, were there different ideas of respect about different body parts?
Yeah. Well, yeah, with what I said about the 2001 that's the most prominent thing I've come across. Otherwise, I mean, again, I work from the perspective of waste, and for them, they don't. For them, it's not that important. They just don't want to know at all what's in there. So the question you're asking, it's important to know whose perspective we're thinking of. So the anatomist who who stores, who manages the school, like an anatomy school or a lab, they've got certain like logistical mindsets about it. You've got to package them on these shelves. You've got to put the bits in this freezer. You've got like different shelves for different things. So there's certain like arrangement, and so they're the kind of person who would say, well, like 2/3, 1/3. You know, you've got to make sound judgment and just do it, because there's a lot of stuff to manage. If you ask about a surgeon, like a surgical instructor, they say, well, you know, everything, every little bit, we need to think carefully. You know, this is a person. There was in one lab, they'd bring a present for the birthday, right? They'd give a birthday gift to the cadaver for their birthday, and like have that kind of special treatment of them. And they will probably, irrespective of how much of them remains there. From the point of view of the waste manager, it doesn't matter. Just don't tell me it's a human. You know, whether it's the fingers or the heads or whatever. It's more, keeps the brain more sane just to call them waste. So it really it's a question. Do you see what I mean about positionality more than anything, of whose view you take?
In your, sorry, I was just going to follow up on that. Because in your images, the drawings, like when you show the horror on the worker's face, right? Mm-hmm. There's a head.
Yeah.
Right. That image might not have the same kind of impact if it was a leg. Right. Mm-hmm. Like that was a choice you made.
Yeah.
Right. It was to put a head in there.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know, just getting at this kind of question about like why that choice? Was that kind of unconscious, or was that like, no, it has to be a head, because that's the most horrifying thing to think about?
Well, it left, I think that's where positionality of me and some of these workers come through, is that I was most surprised by the heads and torsos, especially the heads, where like that's what left me kind of going off and thinking. And I think I wrote a little poem that day as well about a head in the keg that's like dropping down into incinerator. So it left the most imprint kind of impact on me. But then when I had the workshop with the workers as well, there was mention. So the person who got quite disturbed and went home thinking about it, he told me about the heads. He said we had to drop some heads through the charge box, and then I was kind of scratching my own head all day and kind of went home. And so it's what you say, Phil. It's what leaves so much impact on the people at the incinerator, but me as well. And think like this is where drawings are kind of used to perhaps to try to make an impression on whoever looks at them and reads the article. Is the head is kind of is there, like it's surprising. It leaves an emotion. I'm kind of gravitating away from that. So like one of the last drawings I've made, which is not here but I can show it, is of hands. It's someone unwrapping carefully some hands and looking at, analyzing these hands. I can put it on the screen. But that's, to me, I kind of enjoyed making that drawing, and I was like looking at my own hands, and I was kind of thinking of this is like a karma drawing, and I'm doing more and more of this kind of work where it doesn't have to be the extreme thing. Like you don't have to like a big head that's looking straight at you, because that's what the workers end up imagining, and that's not perhaps the best way to think about this, because if you, like in a surgical lab environment, looking at the collection of hands, it does have that effect, a bit like what the person, one of the people with the question said, that it makes you think that it's an object, but it's kind of this, this beautiful object that's a diagram at the same time, and it's in a particular way, and you can sort of draw and study it and appreciate it for what it is. So I think it's going more in this direction, actually, of like not too kind of emotionally intense.
So unfortunately, we are over time, and I know some other folks had some questions, and I'll share those with Mark, and we can, keep the conversation going. But let's go ahead and give Mark a round of applause for his great talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh yeah, so everybody, we're going to Maroon Door, so you're welcome to join us. Try to get there around 4.